The way her captivating, curvaceous body rose and fell with every breath sent a flush of intoxicated desire into Ethan Thompson's eyes. In the next heartbeat, he strode toward the walk-in closet and tossed a shimmering silk nightgown toward her. "Put this on," he commanded, his voice laced with a strange, drunken intensity. Hailey Brooks felt her soul wither away. What on earth was this man doing? A shudder raced through her entire body, feeling as if 1,000 ants were crawling over her skin. "Are you deaf? Didn't you hear me tell you to put this on and get out here? If you're having such a hard time scrubbing the filth off yourself, you should have just told me, darling," he sneered, seeing her standing frozen under the shower. Hailey's breath hitched in her throat. He had stepped inside the bathroom, and she stood there, completely exposed and defenseless before him. She wished the earth would open up and swallow her whole. When Ethan saw the look of sheer terror on her face, he let out a dark, booming laugh. He had been warning her for so long, but the young lady had clearly mistaken his words for empty threats. Well, that didn't matter now. Tonight, she would learn a lesson she would never dare to forget. As his eyes swept over her exquisite form, he stepped closer, resting his hands firmly against the small of her bare back as he joined her under the cascading water. "It seems you intend to fulfill your duties as my wife right here in this bathroom," he taunted, his lips grazing the water droplets as they slid down her neck. "What? What duties?" she asked, her voice trembling and broken. "Your marital rights," he replied. Those two words seemed to drain the very life from her body. He began to press his lips against her skin, trailing kisses across her face, sending her heartbeat into a frantic, chaotic rhythm. "Please don't do this, Mrs. Thompson. I am the widow of your late son. How can you hand me over to someone else like a piece of property under some contract?" Hailey pleaded, sobbing at the feet of the ruthless woman whose face was a mask of cold arrogance. Looking at Victoria Thompson, it was impossible to tell that she had just lost one son, while her other son lived under the shadow of death or imprisonment. "You were the wife of one of my sons, and he is gone. That means you are of no use to us anymore. So take your cursed face and get out of this mansion. Ever since you arrived, you've brought nothing but misfortune." Victoria spat, her voice dripping with pride. She didn't flicker, even at the sight of the girl's tears. A woman who hadn't shed a tear over her own son's corpse was never going to be moved by the tears of an outsider. "My curses will haunt this palace of yours, Mrs. Thompson," Hailey sobbed, her cries reaching a crescendo. She knew how terrifying and powerful the enemy was. Just the thought of the man whose name made her tremble, the man she was now being sold to, made her blood run cold. She had heard countless stories of his brutality. The fear of facing him had permeated every fiber of her being. "Enough, girl. If you had any power at all, you wouldn't be groveling at our feet like this," Victoria Thompson snapped, shoving her away with pure contempt. Her ego refused to bend, even when her son's life was on the line. She was a woman of an arrogant dynasty, and to her, surrendering was the same as dying. Hailey Brooks wiped her tears at the sight of such cold-blooded cruelty, and in the next moment, she stood up with a newfound strength. Her face was now devoid of emotion, her expression completely flat. If this woman wouldn't listen to reason, she would no longer beg. After all, she came from a respectable family, herself. How long could she plead for her freedom? She would accept her imprisonment, but she would no longer allow her dignity to be trampled by this woman. Seeing the sudden resolve on Hailey's face, a dark shadow flickered across Victoria's features for a moment. "I am leaving. But for how long, Victoria Thompson? How long will you keep hiding your sons behind women like cowards? How many girls will you sacrifice at the altar of this blood feud? God's justice is silent but certain. When his staff strikes, your very soul will scream in agony. Then, no son and no girl will come to your aid. Remember my words. Remember the words of Hailey Brooks." It was a historic moment. No one had ever dared to point a finger at Victoria Thompson, nor had anyone ever given her such a stinging retort or reminded her of divine retribution. The arrogant woman stared in shock at the 19-year-old girl who, only moments ago, had been begging at her feet. "How do you?" Before Victoria could lose her mind and strike her, a servant interrupted. "Madam, the family council has reached a decision. Hailey must be presented." Victoria's hand stayed frozen in midair. She cast a murderous look at Hailey, grabbed her by the arm, and shoved her toward the servant. "Take this trash away from here and never let me see her face again. Tell those people not to send anything back from here except her corpse." There wasn't a dry eye in the room as they witnessed the woman's savagery. The girl who had endured years of abuse in that house was now being handed over to the enemy as part of a settlement. Her life had been a living hell here, and her fate there promised to be even more gruesome. She walked into the conference hall filled with men, her innocent frame wrapped tightly in a large shawl. Every man's gaze rose toward her, except for one. He didn't even need to look to know who had entered. He could feel her presence. "Mr. Mark Brooks, if a single eye in this hall is raised toward this girl, I will turn this place into a river of blood." The voice of the man standing across from Mark Brooks was so sharp and authoritative that a deathly silence fell over the room. Every head bowed instantly. The man was so terrifying and volatile that everyone knew he wasn't making an empty threat. Hailey looked at him in awe. He still hadn't turned to look at her. His deep, thunderous voice made her skin crawl, yet she couldn't help but admit it was the most magnificent voice she had ever heard. He was a world-renowned tyrant, but as they say, where there is great darkness, there is often a haunting beauty. If he was a monster, Hailey had to admit the man sitting with his back to her was a breathtakingly handsome one. "Mr. Thompson, do you officially hand over your former daughter-in-law to Ethan Thompson?" An elderly lawyer sitting in the hall asked, seeking to seal the verdict by addressing Mark Brooks. "Her father will do it too." Ethan's mocking voice rang out again. "Yes, I sacrificed this girl for the sake of my son," Mark Brooks said with sickening callousness. "Coward," Ethan muttered, shaking his head in disgust. Hailey's heart shattered into a million pieces. How was she still alive after enduring so much pain? Her own family was ready to sacrifice her. Were daughters really that cheap? Were sons really that precious? Despite her best efforts, a sob escaped her lips. It echoed through the hall, and she immediately held her breath. She knew the man in front of her would react. If he was willing to spill blood just for someone looking at her, what would he do because of her sob? But to her surprise, he remained silent. "Very well. From this day forward, the daughter-in-law of Mark Brooks belongs to Ethan Thompson," the elder announced. Everyone kept their heads down. If he had threatened to kill people when she wasn't even his yet, now that she was his property, he wouldn't tolerate a single glance. They made sure not to even accidentally look in her direction. "I want to legally marry this girl right here before I take her with me," Ethan announced. The hall went silent. This was unprecedented. "But this has never happened before, Mr. Thompson. A girl given as compensation, getting married." The lawyer tried to protest. "Well, a widow has never been given as compensation before either," Ethan countered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Mark Brooks shifted uncomfortably. This man didn't need weapons to kill. His toxic tongue was enough. "I don't want to get married. I will serve my time and then return to this house." Hailey began to speak timidly, but before she could finish, a gunshot rang out near her feet. She let out a piercing scream and recoiled, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her face went bone white, her eyes filled with disbelief. If his aim had been off by an inch, she wouldn't be standing. Her legs shook with terror. "If I hear this girl's voice in this hall again, her corpse will leave this place, followed by the corpse of Harold Brooks." He didn't just threaten. His tone was so certain that everyone trembled. "Call the priest. I want to get married and get out of here. I can't stay among this pack of donkeys and wolves any longer." Ethan ordered a nearby servant, who stammered, "Yes, sir," and ran out. Hailey didn't dare open her mouth again. Her life was the only thing she had left, and she couldn't risk it. She could endure a life of misery, but she was terrified of death. She often said she would choose to live through the deepest pain rather than face the end. Within minutes, the marriage proceedings began in the presence of a priest. "Hailey Brooks, daughter of Raymond Brooks, do you take Ethan Thompson, son of Henry Thompson, as your lawfully wedded husband?" The priest's voice felt like molten lead in her ears. She was the first bride to ever say "I do" while standing in a room full of hundreds of men. She was the only woman there, standing between two servants, accepting this ruthless man as her life partner. She wasn't even allowed to sit down. "I do," she whispered, followed by a hiccup she tried to stifle by pressing her hands to her lips. As soon as the priest finished, Ethan rose and walked out, gesturing for the servants to bring her. Hailey looked toward her in-laws with tearful eyes, but Mark Brooks averted his gaze. They knew they were doing wrong by this innocent girl, but they couldn't bear to lose another son. They turned away in silence. With a tearful, bitter smile, Hailey looked at the back of the man who was supposed to be her protector, but she shook the thought away in agony. "Madam, the master is getting angry," a servant whispered fearfully. Hailey nodded and followed. She was leaving the prison of one tyrant only to enter the cage of another. "I didn't even get a moment to celebrate my freedom, just moved from one cage to the next," she muttered to herself. The world was so cruel. Sitting in the car, she worried about her future. She stole a glance at the man sitting next to her, who had his eyes closed, leaning back against the seat. A line of cars came to a halt in front of the red state mansion. The shadows of evening had stretched long, and a gentle breeze made the weather pleasant. He stepped out of his car, and in the next moment, he grabbed her wrist ruthlessly, dragging her inside. Hailey whimpered at his merciless grip. How can someone be this heartless? She wondered. Once inside, he threw her into the middle of the lounge. She cried out as her forehead struck the corner of a table, and blood began to flow. But who cared here? "Ethan! What kind of behavior is this?" A sharp woman's voice rang out just as Hailey was looking at the blood on her hand. An elegant, beautiful woman was descending the stairs, a scarf wrapped gracefully around her head. "This is the sister of the man who murdered Eric." Ethan didn't just speak, he roared, making the very walls of the mansion vibrate. "His sister?" The woman, Grace, clarified. Ethan looked away. "Yes," he muttered. "Then what is her fault? Why have you brought her here so brutally?" Grace's voice was stern now. "Grace, you don't understand." Ethan started, but she raised a hand to silence him. "Don't give me excuses for your cowardice. You are the offspring of a noble family. Do you know that I also came here under a settlement, and today I rule this house? It was because the man I was tied to became my shield. Dragging a woman into a war between men is a sign of a coward." There was something in her words that captivated Hailey. She looked at the beautiful woman with reverence as she scolded her son. "Say what you want, Grace, but this girl will not know a moment's peace here. She will pay for every sob my Eric uttered," Ethan declared. He was Ethan Thompson. He didn't care what others thought. He died exactly what he wanted. Grace looked at his stubbornness in disbelief and shook her head. Ethan grabbed Hailey's hand and began leading her toward his room. "Auntie, please save me," Hailey cried out instinctively. Ethan stopped and looked at her. "Your own father couldn't save you. Why are you calling for Auntie?" he hissed into her ear, tightening his grip on her wrist. "Ethan, don't you dare hurt her!" Grace's voice distracted him. Seizing the moment, Hailey sank her teeth into his hand and ran to hide behind Grace. "Get out here!" His roar shook the foundations of the house. "Did you hear me? Get out here now!" He roared with such intensity this time that Hailey, paralyzed by fear, stepped out from behind Grace. "Get upstairs," he commanded, pointing. "Ethan!" Grace tried to intervene, but he cut her off. "Grace, please, not today." There was something in his tone that silenced her. Hailey knew she was in trouble. With heavy, trembling steps, she walked toward him, praying under her breath. When she reached him, he grabbed her wrist again and hauled her into the room. "What was that nonsense downstairs?" As soon as they were inside, he snatched the shawl off her head. In the next heartbeat, he realized his mistake. The woman standing before him was a vision of breathtaking beauty. Fair, glowing skin, golden eyes, and a nose that had turned pink from crying. That tiny black mole just above her lip. She was stunning. Ethan was momentarily stunned, not knowing where to look first. He forgot what he was even angry about. All he could remember was that this woman belonged to him, and he had every right to her. Without giving her a chance to react, he slid his hand around her neck and captured her lips with his. He kissed her hungrily, his hands framing her face, losing himself in the moment. When Hailey began to gasp for air, he finally released her. She collapsed to the floor, breathing heavily. Watching her chest heave, that same red mist of desire clouded Ethan's eyes. He pulled a nightgown from the wardrobe and tossed it at her. "Put this on." Hailey sobbed and refused. She had never worn such clothing. "If you had worn it properly, Maybe I wouldn't have to break your spirit, he said, hauling her up by her arm and shoving the silk into her hands. Are you going, or should I strip you myself? Terrified, she moved toward the bathroom. Take a shower first, he called out after her. Hailey shot him a look of pure disgust and slammed the door, but the lock wasn't working. She tried repeatedly and then kicked the door in frustration. Outside, Ethan smirked. He knew there was no lock because he had never felt the need for one. Are you coming out, or am I coming in? He called out a while later, his emotions peaking. When she didn't answer, he growled. Hailey thought she could shower in peace, but her plan was about to crumble. If you're having trouble getting the dirt off, I can help, darling. Hailey froze as he stepped inside. She was still in her clothes under the shower. Ethan laughed. It seems you really do want to fulfill your duties in here. He began to kiss the water droplets off her neck. What duties? Marital rights. That answer felt like a death sentence. He pinned her against the wall, overwhelming her resistance. In that bathroom, Ethan took his revenge and satisfied his obsession. He was in no mood to show mercy. Hailey was fading, but he ruthlessly claimed what he believed was his. She looked at him with pleading eyes, but he was Ethan Thompson. He only listened to himself. He touched her with such ferocity that Hailey left scratches across his back in response. Ethan let out a dark chuckle. He didn't realize that the sweet sting of her nails only fueled his fire. The night went on, and eventually, he carried her toward the bathtub. Exhausted, Hailey rested her head on his shoulder. She could no longer fight him, so she endured his intensity in silence. Lost in each other's arms, they seemed to leave the world and their blood feuds behind. Ethan tried to remain harsh, but every time he saw her innocent face, he softened, a change he couldn't quite explain. In the Red State Mansion, after Henry Thompson, his wife Grace held the most power, followed by the new boss, Ethan. They had 2 children, Ethan and a daughter, Eva. Their uncle Thomas also had 2 children, David and Sophia. There was also an old servant named Martha, who had a son named Eric. Eric was everything to Ethan. Even though he was the son of a servant, Ethan loved him like a brother, and he had essentially died for him. One day, Ethan and Eric were street racing. Ethan had slowed down on purpose to let Eric win. In his excitement, Eric began to do victory donuts with his car when he was struck by an oncoming vehicle. Eric's car was totaled. The driver of the other car was drunk. It was Harold Brooks, Mark Brooks's other son. Ethan tried to save Eric, but he died in his arms. Martha, Eric's mother, couldn't handle the shock and became bedridden. Ethan went mad with grief and demanded Harold's head. 2 weeks later, the family council met, and Hailey was offered as compensation. Instead of blood for blood, Ethan chose Hailey. He wanted to make her suffer. Hailey had been only 14 when she was first married, but she had never truly been a wife. The contract stated she wasn't to be touched until she was 18. But her first husband died when she was only 16. That was why the Brooks family was so quick to hand her over to Ethan to save their own son. When the morning sun hit Hailey's face, she woke up and groaned. Realizing her situation, she felt a wave of shame and looked over at Ethan, who was sleeping peacefully. He looked so innocent while asleep. She couldn't believe this was the same savage man from last night. "What are you looking at? Planning to put a curse on me?" he asked, opening one eye. "No," she said quickly. "Where are you going?" he asked, watching her get out of bed. "To take a shower," she replied innocently, her body aching all over. "I can help with that," Ethan teased. Hailey shook her head. "No, I can manage." Ethan laughed and tried to go back to sleep. Hailey tiptoed toward the bathroom, terrified he might suddenly pounce. "Hey!" she called out from the door. The door doesn't lock. Cher remembered yesterday all too well. "So? Just shower. Who's going to see you?" Ethan didn't get it. "You are!" she blurted out. Ethan glared at her. "Do you really think a cheap lock could stop me from getting to you?" Hailey went inside without a word. Ethan grumbled to himself. Women are such a headache. "Sister-in-law, you are so beautiful," Eva said cheerfully when she saw Hailey. Hailey had applied light makeup to hide the marks Ethan had left. Eva smiled and introduced herself as Ethan's sister. Hailey smiled back. "Who is in that room?" Hailey asked, noticing several servants going in and out. "That's Martha's room. She's Eric's mother." Eva's voice cracked. Hailey's breath hitched. The mother of the boy her brother-in-law had killed. "Can I meet her?" "Absolutely not." Ethan's thunderous voice came from behind them. Hailey turned to see his eyes were bloodshot. "But why?" she asked. "Your tongue moves too much. Control it or I'll cut it out," Ethan warned her before walking away. Hailey took Eva's hand. "Let's go see her together." "Big brother will be furious," Eva whispered, scared. "I'll handle him," Hailey said confidently, as if she had Ethan under her thumb. They went into Martha's room. When Martha saw her, Hailey burst into tears and buried her face in the old woman's chest. She missed her own mother. Both women wept for a long time. Suddenly the door burst open like a storm. Ethan grabbed Hailey by the hair, hauled her up, and delivered a stinging slap that echoed through the room. "I told you not to come here. You don't understand the language of love? Fine, I'll fix you today." He dragged her back to their room. Once inside, he threw her onto the bed and began unbuttoning his shirt. "Please forgive me," she sobbed, begging for mercy, but he pinned her down, unleashing his fury upon her. Hailey's screams filled the room, which hesilanced with his lips. He was making the biggest mistake of his life. No one had ever said no to him, and Hailey's defiance had made him lose his mind. When he finally calmed down, he buried his face in her neck. "Never defy me again," he whispered. Hailey stared blankly at the ceiling. His cruelty had reached its limit. "Look at me," he growled, but she didn't move. "Did you hear me? Look at me." He raised his voice, but she remained motionless. He stared at this stubborn girl who seemed to be her own worst enemy. "Look at me, or prepare for more punishment," he threatened, but she didn't budge. "You are an incredibly stubborn woman," he spat, biting her lip in frustration before heading to the bathroom. As soon as he left, tears streamed down Hailey's face. She regretted her defiance because her eyes were burning with pain. When he came out a while later, Hailey was rubbing her eyes. "Rub them all you want, they won't get any cleaner," he remarked, noticing she was ignoring him. "Getting a bit arrogant, aren't we?" He grabbed her arm, but she pulled away. "Look at me!" he screamed, but it had no effect. For the first time, he felt powerless before a woman. He stormed out of the room. Hailey let out a sigh of relief. "If I don't turn you into a human being, my name isn't Hailey Brooks." Days passed, and seeing Hailey's indifference, Ethan found himself drawn to her more and more. He started coming home early in the evenings. Everyone noticed the change in his behavior. When he learned the truth, that Hailey had been forced into this by her father, he felt a pang of regret. He had accepted her as his wife, but she was remaining out of his reach. He eventually gave her permission to visit Martha, and Hailey took great care of her. One day, while everyone was sitting in the lounge, a commotion broke out outside. It turned out Victoria Thompson was at the gate, begging to come in. Hailey looked at Ethan, who silently sought her permission. Hailey was shocked that he was asking her. She nodded. Victoria came stumbling in and threw herself at Ethan's feet. "Save my child! He's high again and he's hurt someone! Please save him!" Hailey's soul trembled. How easily she asked to save him, even though her son had taken a life. Victoria then fell at Hailey's feet. "My Hailey, forgive me. No doctor will take my son's case. Please tell your husband to save him." The arrogant woman was groveling now, exactly how Hailey once had. "Forgive me, just let my son get treatment," she sobbed. Everyone's eyes were moist. When God's staff finally struck, there was no one left to hear her cries. "Ethan, please, save her son," Hailey pleaded. Ethan was stunned by her grace and patience. Before he could make a call, a servant came running in. "Madam, your son is dead." Victoria collapsed, unconscious, onto the floor. Harold Brooks was dead. God had delivered justice, but the end was grim. Hailey burst into tears and threw her arms around Ethan. The news of the death had shaken her to the core. Ethan held her close, kissing the top of her head. He felt the pain too. He knew what it was like to lose family. They all worked together to look after Victoria, but her screams wouldn't stop. Hailey hid her face in Ethan's neck, and as he squeezed her tight, a single tear from Ethan's eye disappeared into Hailey's hair.